This is Articulating,
an independent school podcast. Welcome to the Articulating podcast. This is our very first LinkedIn event in the 5 seasons that we've existed. So thanks so much for bearing with us. It is not a live event. We are pre-recorded. However, we are live in the comments. So there will be Middle States Association team members available to answer any and all questions that you have about AI, about responsible AI in learning, about the organization. So definitely utilize the comment section as much as possible. My name is Sam Osborne. I am the executive producer of the Articulating podcast, as well as a co-host alongside my very dear friend, Gina Parker Collins, who is the founder of RISE, Resources in Independent School Education. And we want to send a very, very special shout out to Amber Berry, our guest today, who is the Vice President of AI and Strategy at Middle States Association. Amber, thank you so much for all of the time and attention and patience that you dedicated to this series as we work to develop it over the last couple of months. We also want to give a shout out to MSA's president, Christian Talbot, as well as MSA's AI project manager, Morgan Mifflin. Thank you both so much for your partnership. This is a 3-part series, and today we are focused on schools and how they can navigate biases in AI. And then next week, we're going to be student focused, and it's going to be all about equipping students with all of the tools that they need to use AI effectively and safely and responsibly. And then last, we're going to have a parent-focused episode, which is all about how parents and guardians can leverage AI for admissions, for managing their students' calendars and very busy schedules, and also for personal use. So it's going to be a really great 3-part series. Please share it with your school community, share it with family and friends, and please enjoy. Thanks so much for joining us. Amber's dialing in from Philly, and every email she sends us has something to do with the Eagles.
Go Birds.
Go Birds.
Yes.
So I just wanted to give you that opportunity before you tried to integrate it in the rest of the episode.
I bleed green. I might have only been here for a year and a half, but we are with it.
Yes. So Middle States is... when I think of it, it's all about accreditation. How did you all get involved in AI?
That's a really great question. So our president and CEO, his name is Christian Talbot. He started in the summer of 2022 and immediately launched our strategic plan. And as you know, just a few months later, ChatGPT was released. So 4 months on the job, he is trying to align the direction of our organization. And he determined that the vision for our company would be to become the source for school leaders to transform themselves and their schools. And so if you think about that kind of vision, of course, it has everything to do with accreditation and meeting standards and excellence in education. And it also totally met the moment in terms of AI. So he personally immersed himself in using the tool, and he recognized right away that this was going to be transformative technology. And he had this idea for RAIL. We call it Responsible AI in Learning. And it's a series of endorsements to guide schools and school leaders to transform themselves and their schools to meet our vision. And RAIL was attempted to be a little pilot of 8 schools in the spring, but we are serving 60 schools this year. We are in 28 countries, and we're directly impacting 55,000 students in our opening year.
Really proud of what you do. I had no idea that it's been less than 2 years, Amber, that this has existed.
We're just at the beginning.
AI has existed for decades, but generative AI being accessible to everyone, that's a recent development, so there's a lot of implications for that. Can you paint a picture of what it looks like right now, how schools are using it?
So I would say that for the most part, ed tech companies are really focusing on two areas. It's like classroom practices and then it's policies. And so if a school leader is looking for support right now, you'll probably find one of those two things. And what we did for Rail is we're modeling after Stuart Brand's Pace Layer model. And so that's why we start with culture and identity of a school. And then we move to governance, that's your policy layer. And then we move to infrastructure, who's responsible for what, and is what you have right now what is really going to serve the school in the future? Or do you need to develop capacity? Then we get to programs. And then at the last point, we're at practices. And so we have a lot of intentionality in how we design this because too much was missing. You can't just throw a policy at someone and you haven't really aligned back to Portrait of a Graduate, what our responsibility is before we launch students into the world.
For schools that are using generative AI, do you have an idea of what they're budgeting for it? Which departments are using it?
Generative AI, it is personal and professional. I blend it so much. I am looking up how to do an air fryer recipe as fast as I am generating speaker notes for a presentation as a first draft. And so for schools, they might be using elements of generative AI through platforms that they're using. I know it's creeping into certain LMSs and tech tools that they've already been using. Grammarly is often a hot topic these days in schools that now generative AI is here, and that's still an okay tool for students to be using. So I think folks are all over the place. I also see a lot of emphasis on like teachers using the tool or not using it, whether they're allowing student access, which is also age dependent because many of the chatbots that are popular are for 18 and older or for much older students. But that said, it's also generative AI is for business managers, right? It's for your operations team. It's for the athletics program. And so I see schools really dabbling in a lot of arenas. I love that you asked the budget question in particular, because I don't know where schools are landing with this, but we see everything from allowing teachers to use a chatbot, for example, and maybe but not paying the monthly fee for the premium experience. But then also there are some school designed generative AI supports that do lesson planning and help with grading. And so those school-wide platforms have a major impact. And some schools are putting the money behind that and really experimenting. I see a lot of independent schools working with Magic School and Flint AI, for example, as great supports that have kind of tutoring and lots of features available to support.
You bring up something that for me is that personal piece of AI, right? I was cool with using Grammarly. I didn't feel like I was cheating with Grammarly. You're just going over my grammar. But increasingly, I have been using ChatGPT, right? And understanding that I am not cheating because the only thing that it gives me back is what I put in, but just better. So, how are folks feeling about the moral issue of ChatGPT and generative AI, and not only on the personal level, but with schools as well?
I'll start with like just the ethical generalization. I just gave this analogy to a group of women educators I was working with yesterday. I think of it a little bit more like a Hallmark card. I do occasionally handwrite a very personal note or letter to someone. And that's one way of expressing my thanks or acknowledging someone. But when it comes to Mother's Day, I pour through the section, I look through all the cards, and I select the one that like just matches, and then I send that off. And I'm the person in the loop. Does anyone go to the card section, just like grab a card and mail it and like, I hope it's relevant? Like, you are the person who has a critical eye. You're making sure it meets the moment. You're making sure it's respectful and it feels like you. Occasionally, you might even edit it a little bit to personalize
Right.
it or add an extra note. To me, that's generative AI. The experience is not supposed to be, I've created something and I send it off. I haven't proofed it, edited it, changed it. It's also supposed to
Mhm.
be a conversation, not just a quick search. And so the interaction you're having is shaping it to be the voice and the message you want to convey. So I feel a little bit better about that kind of moral ambiguity, but not everyone's there. Some folks still feel like
Mhm.
there's certain things that aren't okay to use generative AI yet, and that's fine. So I would advise someone who's kind of in that starting point to say, what are the things that aren't super worth your time? If you have a lot of emails
There
and
you
your
go.
job is not to personalize every
Mhm,
email at a high level, if that's not
mhm.
what you're, compensated for and it's not serving you, then use generative AI to make that a faster process, and then spend your time and energy in that really great thought work on the projects, on being able to walk down the hallways to classrooms and connect with teachers and watch kids in action, and not sit in your office doing email all afternoon.
It's the efficiency part for me. It is definitely the efficiency part. Yeah, yeah.
So our independent school podcast is primarily focused on equity. Um, just came from Afrotech, as you might imagine. The intersection of equity and AI came up a lot, not so much in the independent school space. Could you share in the independent school space if equity is even an issue and what those issues might look like?
Equity, of course, is an issue. And I feel like an easy way for me to answer this is to give like a super specific example. So, taking AI out of it, I love Eric Hudson is a fabulous education consultant and blogger, and he wrote a piece about asking good questions. And it is a good question to ask in general, is equity an issue in independent schools? And it's also a good question to ask, is AI exacerbating or contributing to equity issues in schools? And if we just talk about acceptable help, I mean, I feel bad for school leaders who have to solve a problem that I think is incredibly complex. So first of all, does your independent school define what acceptable help is in a very clear way? Meaning, can a student use tutors outside of school? I know culturally, some schools that's happening quite a bit. There's a math tutor and an English tutor, a writing coach, there's a homework helper. There's a lot of intervention. And so the work that's produced from home or the supplement to daytime instruction really propels certain kids a lot farther and faster than others. Is there any kind of guidance on that in your policies? Can parents help? Can parents be an expert in a particular field and be helpful? I was a world language teacher. I can't wait to tutor my kids in French one day. And then it's also the kids who hop on FaceTime with their group of friends and work out a problem set as a group. Do you have policies on that? On is that kind of group approach okay? Or is that something that you would frown upon? So, acceptable help is an equity issue in independent schools, and some struggle with it more than others. So, I would say start with having policies. But now, teachers and families and students, we're seeing this in the news. There are some legal battles over, well, are we allowed to use generative AI on our homework? And if you haven't answered the acceptable help question, then that's a tough one to just say yes or no. So let's imagine the school says, because we allow for tutors and parents and group chats for problem sets, we're allowing generative AI. Well, as a school, do you provide computers for all students? And does everyone have stable internet access? In 2020, many of us were surprised as school leaders to find out that not every student did have reliable internet access, or just the number of folks in that home who now needed to be on the internet at the same time meant that there were some challenges for learning. So the equity issues abound. So imagine the school that's going to say generative AI is not acceptable. That's not what we're testing. Then I would really want that school to be able to answer, in what ways is it acceptable that a student could have the homework help and the tutors and the parents and the friends, and then another student who might not have access, time, or resources for that may not have generative AI. So a very complex question.
What about those who have not set those rules and they don't want any generative AI? Are there tools now that can indicate whether or not they know that a student has used generative AI in getting work done?
Educators' number one concerns, both anecdotally and by survey data, is that they're concerned about plagiarism and cheating. So school leaders are in it in terms of trying to mitigate and figure this out. I have not seen any evidence in support of AI catchers that are lacking bias. And unfortunately, the bias is usually on the axis of, if English is not your first language, or if you're neurodivergent, the chance that generative AI catchers will say that you have plagiarized when you haven't is too high. It's too much of a risk. So we don't encourage it. We wish schools would really question the practice. And this is tough because English teachers have been using Turnitin as an example of just a brand that's popular for many, many years. It's the generative AI feature that it now has that is the problem. And so I know, at least in my home district where my kids attend, they don't allow the generative AI feature to be turned on. But yeah, this is a tricky question. And most of the data now that I have seen is at the college level, but I imagine it would just be exacerbated for younger kids.
Okay. You touched on two biases, the neurodivergence, English as a second language. Are there other common biases that you're seeing with the use of AI in schools?
I would say, just as we think about, AI has been around for a long time, but generative AI is this like new capacity that it can generate new information, something that's never existed before. However, it is trained on mostly Western data. And so if you imagine, and from the internet, right? So if you imagine that it's drawing on a very North American perspective on beauty standards, for example, or what education might look like around the world. There's so many stereotypes inherent. I was just learning actually from one of my colleagues that there's a lot of back and forth about whether or not you should be polite to AI. Well, it turns out the
I
ruder you
am.
are, say please and thank you.
I say please so the robots don't get me.
iRobot was a powerful movie. There is that. But also, the ruder you are, the more likely your chatbot is going to emulate where rude interactions take place. So, do you want it drawing from Reddit forums, or do you want it drawing from reputable sources? And so there is a ton of bias inherent. And I'll contribute one of my own recent faux pas. Last month, I was presenting to world leaders in Dubai and Rail. And in my slide deck, there were images of classrooms with a Middle Eastern look. At least I thought so. And it turns out that most of my images had men as the teachers, and most of the girls featured in my images were wearing a hijab. And both of those are stereotypes that are not accurate. So I am really grateful to the thoughtful educator who called me in and brought it to my attention that it is a very Western perspective, that that's what a classroom looks like, but it's not accurate. And so I have a different lens now that it's brought to my attention, that the unconscious bias that I had, or my lack of ability to be critical of those images in the right way. I mean, I did scrap some of the images knowing they weren't right, but I didn't catch that one. And so this is the ongoing training that school leaders need, that educators need, and that we need to raise our students in really being exposed to how they can differentiate and have a critical eye.
Amber, I'm kind of thinking about you're touching on potential harms, you're touching on potential biases. I think I'm struggling to understand the harm, especially when comparing AI in education to AI in healthcare, um,
Hmm.
AI in recruiting and workforce building. What are the consequences of not managing your AI policies and AI use in the school setting?
I mean, there are so many risks that you would take. And again, like if you just even look at some news headlines of some of the questionable events that have come up, and you both have brought things to my attention I didn't even know about. But students in particular are making mistakes. And when you don't have policies, you're not protecting yourself for, like, here's why we're going to have this series of consequences. And so much of this is unprecedented. So it's really hard for a school to be prepared for something that is very new and evolving constantly. I would say that, certainly, the best practice that we had in our school and that we are recommending for rail schools is, consider consulting a lawyer to review your policies, someone who is tasked with keeping up with the current state of things and able to compare to state laws, to any federal mandates. Even that's uneven, right? Not every state has guiding policies for schools. So this is just a tricky landscape of people making mistakes, a lot of good intentions. But I think the chance that schools are going to find themselves in murky waters and school leaders are going to be feeling like they're encountering something that they just truly have never seen before is likely. So when the community is increasing its AI literacy and awareness, like use the tool, understand the tool. You don't have to like it. You don't have to think it's the next best thing. You don't have to feel positively about it. But if you're uninformed, that's a problem, especially because we know students are dabbling and teachers are using it. And yeah, so I would say definitely use it and also seek good counsel on things like this.
Do you feel like the state of AI, Gen AI in schools right now, that there's an urgency to evolve on the tool side or on the institution side?
Ooh, I don't know if you can have one without the other effectively. I would say institution side, well, oh, that's hard. That's a little bit chicken or the egg. I feel like it's all in our laps together and we just have to deal with it. So I think the tools here, and some folks are already in it, and some pretty deep. So knowing that, I think the institution side has to be prioritized. I think a lot of schools have been waiting and hoping for something to just appear that's going to make this better and be like, okay, that's our best practice. We'll emulate that. And we need more schools to really take a step forward and say, I'm going to start working on this, even though we're not entirely sure that what we plan for now is going to be it. Think of this as iterative. Think of this as something that you're going to have to keep circling back to. So I would say institution. Yeah, it's time.
I'm really curious. So Middle States has been doing a tremendous amount of work supporting many more schools than you had anticipated at this point in time. What is the or some of the most innovative work that you've seen
Mm.
among the schools that you're working with? What are you most excited about?
Oh, I love all of this. I loved working in schools full time for 15 years and being a classroom teacher, but
Wow.
working with so many schools and these leaders who are so thoughtful and sharing things that just I wouldn't have had this kind of broad exposure without doing this kind of work now. So I love that. Some of the things I like the most are the ability to create sandboxes for educators and students that schools are designing to allow safe experimentation. So these are the schools that like have an open invitation on Tuesday mornings for teachers to learn something new and just try it. And so that 30 minutes of bringing folks who have maybe more of an early adopter mindset, who are very curious together, I think it's incredible. And I think I would have been one of those teachers who came in a few minutes early and gave
Yeah,
my
yeah.
lunch hour up for that. So I love schools that are making space. There is a lot to be worried about, and I think that's very healthy and appropriate. There's also a lot of opportunity, and I do believe that generative AI can be weaponized, and I believe it can be used as a tool for transformation. So I really appreciate when I do hear that teachers get the license to try some things out, to have some safe failures. We work with a school in Pittsburgh, and like the model that they have is like take a small risk, experiment over a period of time and report back. And so even just creating cultures of sharing, I constantly share like what are the use cases? Like how am I using generative AI in ways that I haven't before? Have I used it to plan a trip? Absolutely. Have I used it for holiday shopping? Of course.
Mhm.
And so being in a space where folks can share, how do I use it as a tutor tool with my son every day for math? I love that spirit of sharing. And so schools that are cultivating that intentionally and being transparent with the parents and sharing with them what's happening inside these walls, what could be happening inside their homes, they're doing the greatest work right now.
Is there a case for if a school is utilizing Gen AI for their operations, their administration, is there potentially a case for reducing tuition or maybe increasing aid?
My guess is it might be a little too early to tell yet. I know that this tips into big fears. So, teachers' number four fear from a recent survey this year is that they will not have job security because of generative AI. And I love Ethan Malik from UPenn, the Wharton
My
School.
professor.
Stop it, really?
Yeah, I
Oh my
did a
goodness,
VC class with him.
You're so lucky. I can't wait to meet him. I read everything that comes out. I have not finished Co-Intelligence yet, but this quote does come
Oh.
from his book where he said he doesn't predict that generative AI is going to take everyone's jobs, but he does see that people who use generative AI effectively are going to be at an incredible competitive edge. And so I would see maybe over time that those efficiencies absolutely could result in maybe we don't need to hire quite as many people. Maybe it's not classroom teachers we're talking about, because remember that human connection is the piece that we don't want to lose in all of this. But
Mhm.
maybe there's some other operational pieces. But I think more independent schools operate on a gap, right? They operate at a deficit. They
Yeah.
do not charge enough tuition to cover
Mhm.
their expenses. So while the gap might decrease, I don't know that that's going to impact aid right away, but it would lead to more financially sustainable schools for the future. And maybe that opens up and unlocks what that giving culture could do for a
Mhm.
school.
What have you done surveys with schools? I'm curious, have you done surveys with parents? Have you done surveys with students around generative AI and how they use it personally and professionally?
I can't think of an example offhand of a school or, certainly MSA has not tapped into that. I think because I'm such a recent school leader, I think a lot about parents in MSA's network. And that's an
Mhm.
area I'd love to tap because if I think of myself as a parent and myself as a principal, parents are looking for guidance. They're looking for ideas. They're looking for how they can parent better, raise their kids better, have great experiences in these amazing school communities. So I wish that were happening more. But I guess we kind of have to start with the teachers and the schools and kind of aligning them. But part of that
Mhm.
work, like with Rail, is about internal, external marketing and also a change plan that includes parents. And so all of the schools that we work with are engaging with families, and that looks like admission season's coming up. So let's talk a
Yep.
little bit about what our school is doing strategically, things like that. But
Mhm.
yes, that's a really
Yeah.
good question. And in terms of students, I don't know if there's been formal surveys of it, but I do know that through teacher surveys, schools are discovering more and more about students that only the classroom teachers knew and school leaders weren't aware about in terms of practices.
Jeez. I mean, like, listen, we go back to I don't want to age myself, but the crib notes, like that was that was the cheat sheet then. And we have evolved so much. I mean, that move from Grammarly again to generative AI or chat GBT is such a leap. And I am definitely cooler with the idea that I utilize this as a tool than I was a couple of months ago. And our dependence upon it, I mean, I go to it often. I really do. Do you think that there's a place for generative AI to be in the landscape of research? Like, should it be compartmentalized or should it like really be utilized, like the whole tool be utilized? Or is there just portions or opportunities where we should be inserting it so that we can lead, be human led as opposed to AI led?
I refuse to box us in right now. I think we
Mhm.
should think expansively in this moment, and we're going to learn and we're going to fail. And
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
important and okay. And we should be transparent about what those failures are with one another. So I think it's too soon to say we should be putting a lid on it. We should only use it for these limited use cases. And yet,
Mm.
so Leon Furs has an AI assessment scale, and other folks kind of subscribe to the stoplight scale of like, of course, you have boundaries in your policies. So
Mhm.
never put personally identifiable information into a chatbot. Never share someone's full name and their phone number. And
Yeah.
so I think we'll see limitations where, unless you kind of have a random numbering system for students, you can imagine like medical data and like counseling information, certain things shouldn't be there. But if we could take some case studies of our counseling load for a year as a school and run some analysis on that, we might get some best practices. We might be able to really hone in on what are our students struggling with and what might we do in order to work on that. A human can do that. But when we're at scale, when some of our counselors are really maxed out and working with so many kids at once,
Mm.
able to have a more of an objective review of that data would be incredible. What's a safe way of doing that? And I don't know if we're there yet. I don't know if that's where we should be starting. I think about some schools that are under resourced and don't have the counseling staff they need to work with all their students. And so I've heard of some adults who have used generative AI like to help with a panic attack. And they found that the mindfulness exercises and things that they are run through the generative AI of their choice, it really mirrors what their therapist would do. And they're not doing this with an
Mm.
of a human that they would go to and rely on, but like in a maybe minor crisis or a point where they don't have a human to help them through that moment. And so should there we be doing research on how maybe generative AI could support mental health and well-being in a safe way? We should be doing that research. We should not be experimenting on kids, but we should be doing that research because imagine what that could do for kids to have tools. They're not always with a caring adult when they need it. And so what would that look like?
What that can do for kids, and as well as what that can do for faculty and those practitioners, because you're touching on, they might be overworked. And with the existence of Gen AI, I do think people are taking on way more than they have before. As opposed to it lightening people's workloads, they believe they have the capacity to do more, when in actuality, they might be strained, they might be even more stressed than before. So this weekend, I saw a YouTuber recommend that when you do Chat GPT or one of these other, I think it's MLLs, LML,
LLM,
LLMs, like large
language models.
libraries.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry, y'all got to back up. I don't know that one yet. Can somebody just briefly?
Long Large language models, which are like a chat gpt, where it's just kind of a generalist AI tool, where you are literally like dumping whatever you want into it and it's producing something back to you, versus something a little bit more narrow. Did I get that right, Amber?
That was pretty dang good. So, as an
Okay.
example, we're taking everything we've ever done related to Rail. We're creating our own Rail LLM. So, like maybe instead of called Chat GPT, it's called Rail. And anyone who wants to know anything about Rail could interact with that chatbot. It's not going to tell you random things, other things. It's going to tell you anything you want to know about Rail. How long is the
Mm.
process? How much does this cost? What did I? And so you can create like these closed, if you will, systems. Like
Oh,
imagine a
okay.
school, all of their internal docs minus PII and private things in that system, and then what that would do.
So, to my understanding, the challenge with an LLM is that you trust it too much, or you depend on their answer that they've given you, not realizing that it's quite possible they haven't given you a correct answer, or that they've hallucinated something. They filled in blanks that you didn't even ask it to fill in. And so, a YouTuber I was watching was saying something like, when you ask the question, ask back, have the dialogue with the tool, what have I missed? What do I need to plug in? For administrators and for educators using Gen AI, what are those little ways, little things they can remember throughout the day to make sure that they're not overlooking a potential bias?
I'll start with I used the expression earlier, falling asleep at the wheel, for a reason. Apparently, the more you use generative AI, the more comfortable you get with its outputs, the more likely that you're to miss like glaringly
Mm.
obvious inaccuracies and things. And so slow down, have a critical eye, always be the human in the loop. Don't over rely because otherwise you will put out errors. And look, I mean, if I type an email too fast, I have more typos than usual. So it's not that off, but the impact could
Mm.
be a lot worse depending on what that error, hallucination, or gap might be. So unintended consequences that are unforced errors don't make sense. I would say there's a few things folks do that I think are good practice. One thing I love is like asking for different tones. So like if you're doing a piece and like I am a positive, optimistic person, this is natural to my personality and I'm not putting on for you. That said, because I know that's my tendency, I occasionally write something and then I share my writing and I say, write this in an extremely positive pro way, write this in a very anti negative way, write this, rewrite this in more of a neutral way. and I read my writing and I read those samples, and I'm like, where am I landing? And is that my intention? Is that appropriate for this audience or this tool? So having a practice of asking for different tones, or just asking generative AI to act as like to give you feedback, is another way to go about this. So saying something like, I'm writing a difficult email to a parent, and is my tone both firm and holding a line while being empathetic? And like, give me some feedback, give me some concrete examples of how I'm doing this or I'm missing this mark. So I think the practice of having a critical eye is important. A lot of people approach generative AI as like, oh, I just want to brainstorm a million ideas for a party, or just thinking very expansively, brainstorm first draft. But the strategist level, I think of that as almost like a tier 3 level, is here is my slide deck for a presentation. What questions do you have for me? Now I'm anticipating what that Q&A is for the board at the end of this presentation, but I'm also maybe considering adding in more information or explaining more if there are gaps in this. So how many people practice their presentation with someone else beforehand? So I think that critical process, in the same way you would interact with, I treat generative AI like an intern. So in the same way that I would interact with an intern, I don't say take this and run with it and like send it on my behalf without eyes. I would say things like, I'm giving you feedback. I want you to do this for me next. What do you think of this? Offer your opinion. So I think all of those are really helpful practices.
Thank you for that because it really gets us back to that efficiency piece, but at what cost, right? We can't be so efficient that we're not thinking critically about what AI is giving back to us, and then maybe even asking it a second question to make sure the tone is right. I mean, thank you so much. That was really great feedback.
Schools are precious. The children that are in those schools are poised for amazing things. And we want to make sure that they succeed, that they're protected, that to your point, they are not the guinea pigs as we are figuring out AI. Do you think there are areas of school operations, curriculum, where we are not yet ready to apply generative AI?
I think what I would recommend to a school leader is to consider experimentations that do not in any way take away from the great processes and protocols you already have. So I would recommend that a school consider some of their kind of crisis management protocols and see if generative AI could be an assistant in any way, shape, or form. But I would not recommend that they automate the fire drill and see how it works out, right? So I would say it's worth experimenting, even in the realm of safety, but always, always, always keeping the human in the loop, and see if there are
Mm,
ways that could there be fewer areas, could there be fewer errors if someone is using generative AI as a check, for example. I'm thinking about all of the emergency training I did as a teacher, the CPR, the like all kinds of first aid kinds of interventions. If there is a way that generative AI, there is an LLM that pulls up things that are like reminders of best practice, maybe that would be helpful. But it's not in the absence of me doing exactly what I've been trained to do and not slowing down in that, but maybe seeing if these tools could be an assist in some way. Again, we talked a little bit about kind of mental health realm and counseling and anything medical. I would say being very, very careful with those teams that they understand what can and cannot go online. And then being careful with student data, privacy, security, because we don't really understand everything right now. So, what are the
mm,
implications of sharing student data in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? So, being really careful of that. And then the last
mm,
one would just be that, we talked a little bit about this training, that it's a Western lens of training. So as schools are looking to be inclusive places of belonging and leaning into curriculum that often needs fresh eyes or revamps so that there's windows and mirrors in terms of student experience, knowing that generative AI is going to have biases in that process means having going back to that AI, critical AI lens will be imperative. So I would say cautiously proceed in terms of curriculum support, particularly around areas of cultural diversity and things of that nature.
mhm, mhm.
So, as we close, I just want to make sure that we leave our stakeholders with the need to knows. What could you close with? What's something they can take away from this?
I would say please start experimenting safely. Make an account, log on today, and start to see what this is all about if you haven't already. And if you're looking for different kinds of guidance, our MSA Evolution Lab website does have some AI literacy suggestions. So if you
Great.
don't really know where to get started, a lot of them are free. If you're thinking specifically about cyber safety, I do have a plug for AI educators. It's a co-woman founded organization, and it's about navigating the legal and ethical issues related to generative AI in the classroom. One of the greatest trainings I have gone through. And if I were leading a school, I would mandate my CFO and probably my IT director to take that with me, so that we're kind of rowing in the same direction and have a great understanding. And the information's changing every day. So if you are able to add in like one more thought leader to follow, I do highly recommend Ethan Mollick. And if you could get one newsletter, EdTech Weekly is a great one to kind of keep up with how tools are showing up in classrooms and education spaces. Kind of reviews and perspectives on those can be super helpful as well.
This is fantastic, and it's so timely. Things are just moving so quickly, and we're adopting tools that we may have resisted before in grand fashion, and the opportunity to think more critically about them is extremely important for so many reasons. So thank you so much. I'm excited about the series. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this tremendously. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm
Absolutely.
glad you enjoyed it because we got two more to do.
Yes, we do.
All right.
If you enjoyed listening to this discussion, please pass it on to a friend. And don't forget to hit subscribe and follow us on Instagram at our parent organization at 4Rise. That's the number 4, RIISE. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.